What is it?
The main thing I got from it was like this sense of feeling seen and validated.
Well, why does it have to be this way?
This book was placed in my hand for this moment.
Insightful, learned a lot, wrote some quotes that I'm ready to like paint on my wall.
I love this book!
That we just kind of pull out some of the big themes that we see and talk about a few different ones.
I apologize if most of my contribution has K-pop references.
Alternative book title, The Feminine Mystique Part 2. You were really just gay all along. Welcome to Book Club.
With Julia.
And Victoria.
We are two lifelong friends who read a book and talk about it each episode.
This is a podcast where we explore new perspectives and use books as a tool for personal and community growth.
This week, oh boy, we are reading Ayoade on Tap by Richard Ayoade, a nonfiction book in which a comedian gives like a mock academic analysis of a very bad movie starring Gwyneth Paltrow about flight attendants. And if that sounds like the weirdest premise for a book ever, don't worry, it is. There might be some spoilers, but honestly, you just gotta be along for the ride with this one.
So this is a book that was sitting on our shelf of important books in our house. I don't know why. That was just a shelf we had of this is some core reading
that I put together.
That Julia put together, which I had not read. But she was like, this book is my life. It was written for me. It is so important. But I was always a little intimidated because she was always describing it as so niche, and she was afraid I wouldn't like it or get it, which to be fair, I don't know a lot about films and film history, so I was like, oh, you're right, I probably won't. And it's Julia's brain in a book. She probably doesn't want to subject it to a lot of scrutiny, so I just won't read it. But I absolutely loved it, and I thought it was really fun. The mock seriousness of the film criticism, which is kind of a cousin of literary criticism, was just right up my alley. Even though I didn't know necessarily what is typical in film analysis, it's not totally different from how we analyze books and other stuff. And I had Julia's annotated copy, so if I was really out of luck, Julia had already told me what it was referencing.
The second time I read through it, I made sure, I was like, oh, Victoria's not going to know what that is. And I wrote it in the margin.
Oh my goodness. That makes a lot of sense. I think you did a pretty good job.
Thank you.
Because there wasn't any that I was well, there was a couple that I was well, yeah, I know that. But I was well, maybe Julie was just, writing that for herself. I gave you the benefit of the doubt. What surprised me the most was I actually had heard of this film before. When I started reading the first part of this book, and I was just flipping to see how much of it was his essay writing and how much was I saw there was an index in the back. And then I started reading the index, which is hilarious. And I noticed Rob Lowe, and I was like, wait, what? Rob Lowe's in this? And for those of you who are longtime listeners of this podcast, for the entire year of 2021, I have been watching The West Wing. No, I haven't been watching it multiple times. It's literally taking me 9 months now to only get to season 5. And I've also been listening to The West Wing Weekly, which is a podcast that Joshua Malina does. Anyways, I was oh, there's Rob Lowe in this, there's a West Wing connection, I'm intrigued. And then I see Joshua Malina is in the index of Ayoade on top. So I was wait. So then I look up the IMDb and I realize Josh Malina was in this film, and I'm oh my gosh, this is the film that he was kind of mortified to talk about once. It got brought up on the podcast that he had done a film that Rob Lowe was also in, and then he had to explain well, we weren't in any scenes together, we never filmed together, and how the film was supposed to come out in 2001, but with 9/11, a comedy about airlines didn't seem right, and so it got delayed and redone. So anyways, my little West Wing infatuated heart was very excited to have that connection, and then also drew me in. And then of course I was Vern, we have to watch this movie, and he's but you just told me it was a terrible movie, why would we watch it? And I'm because we have to. It was as ridiculous as I thought, but it was fun to have the actual image of the film in my head as I was reading the rest of the book.
Oh my god, yeah, when you said you had heard of it, because I had never heard of the film, and I have no intention of watching it. It sounds awful. I was just blown away that you had some connection to it. I was anyone has heard of this movie. This is so wild. I mean, even the fact that Richard Ayoade, who's like a filmmaker himself, and he watched this.
Yeah, I'm like, was he on like a weird like Netflix recommended binge? Was he seeking out terrible movies? But I mean, it's like a stacked cast of big names. It's like shocking how bad this group of like it's like they were working with a really rough script if this many big name actors like couldn't make this movie work.
But didn't he address in the book how like Mark Ruffalo thought it was a sex comedy, like a 70s sex comedy, and
I'm like I need to go find that interview with Mark Ruffalo, who's like, wait a second.
Yeah, so I imagine the original cut that was supposed to come out pre 9/11 was much raunchier and was like a totally different story almost. Then the re-edit is what was. Like, it probably wasn't that great to begin with, but I imagine the re-edit is what made it really, really bad.
Right. I know. When I read that portion that there was like another original edit of this movie, I'm like, where is it? I want to see it. I want to know.
Yeah. That would be fun.
Also, like, as the love interest of the movie, to been like, yeah, I thought it was going to be like a sex comedy. Like, how many scenes did he shoot that he's now like, that didn't go anywhere?
Yeah.
Like, that wasn't included because there are no sex scenes.
There are 0 sex scenes, which means that, like, I imagine multiple of these men were paid to get naked and then never showed on camera. It's a lot to put yourself through. When Victoria told me that she enjoyed this book and that she thought it was funny, I breathed a huge sigh of relief because it was like so specific to me and so personal. I was like really with special interests like that I hold them very close to my chest because I've been burned many times before, where like people are like, this is the weirdest thing I've ever seen. Why do you like this? Or like someone makes fun of it and they don't know that I like it. I'm like, oh my God, thank God I didn't say that I like that thing. So when I introduce people to things that are this close to me, I tend to put a lot of caveats on them. I want to lower the bar so low that you're just like pleasantly surprised when it makes any sense to you. That's kind of my goal, because I'm trying to protect myself from what I assume is like, oh, you're not going to like this. When like really, I should have known, like a lot of the topics in this book, the only overlap that you don't have is the film history.
Right.
Like you are familiar with everything and, all the other jokes you would get. So like, I should have figured you would like it, but it,
That's fair. I mean, I feel like that's a very common approach when you really enjoy something that you like want to share with someone else. It's almost like, I don't know, it makes me think of different places or books that I like would really hesitate before telling someone like I was going on a date with that I really enjoyed, or like or that I would take them there or have them read the book because I didn't yet know how that date was gonna go. And so it's kind of like you have like, I don't know, for those of you who've been in the dating world, when you have like a coffee shop that you're like, that's the place I take dates to, because I'm not taking them to my actual coffee shop because I don't want them to ruin it for me. Like, this is my place, this is my book, this is my thing, and I'm only going to open my heart to someone that I think I can trust with this special thing because I don't want them ruining it for me.
So, the story of why this book is so special to me. I'm a huge fan of the author. He's like a very English comic he's known for being like super awkward and geeky and strange, but also like very endearing. Like you just kind of love him as a person and want to give him a hug. I'm obsessed with him. There's this one appearance of his on a quiz show that I literally watch over and over. So I found out about this book because he did an appearance on Graham Norton, which is like British Tonight Show, where he talked about this book. He was describing the premise of it very badly. And I was just like, immediately was like, I have to read this book. So in the manner of my family, Christmas was coming up and I told my brother to buy it for me because that's how Christmas gifts in the Clausen household work. And he found it, but only on like Amazon UK. Like it wasn't available at all in the US. And he was like, "Are you sure this is what you want me to buy? It might take like 4 months to get here." And I was like, "Yes, that's what I want." So
4 months. I'm like, did someone have to like paddle a canoe with this book across the Atlantic? Like,
it took so long.
it did. I remember you got it in like, I don't know, well after Christmas.
Oh yeah. It finally got to me and I read it like early pandemic and like laughing out loud, like cackling the entire time I was reading it. Like I just loved it so much. Like from the first page, I was like, this is my book. This is my book. This is it. And it was even better reading it the second time somehow. Like I picked up on other jokes and like I had never watched the film before, but he walks you through the whole thing like shot by shot. So you don't really need to.
Yeah, by the time you finish reading it, you've seen the film.
You've seen the film.
And it was more enjoyable than actually watching it.
Probably, yeah. Like I just feel like his humor is specifically designed to make me laugh. Like every single thing that comes out of his mouth. I watch all of his stuff, even his weird appearances. I read everything he does because I'm just like, it's perfect. Yeah, so anyway, I'm very glad Victoria liked it.
So, a little bit about Richard Ayoade. This is from BBC America, 10 Things You Never Knew About Multi-Talented Richard Ayoade. He hosted the BAFTA TV Awards during the pandemic, the 2020, the virtual ones. So this was like a lead up to, they're like, if you don't know who this guy is. So he's born in London to a Norwegian mother and a Nigerian father. And as Julia mentioned, he's now kind of a powerhouse of British pop culture and comedy. So since he began his career 20 years ago or so, he's since been known for his comedy roles in The IT Crowd and the TV show The Mighty Boosh. He directed the British indie film Submarine and The Double, and hosted the game show The Crystal Maze, as well as a travel documentary series, and written very funny books like this one, as well as a few others. So he's done lots and lots of things. So we'll go quickly through these 10 things that you never knew, which is also like, okay, you read one book about him and you've heard most of these things. But he grew up in the English town of Ipswich, and he was obsessed with J.D. Salinger's The Catcher in the Rye. There's actually a bit in Ayoade on Top when he talks about dressing up as Holden Caulfield, and it's hilarious. So he's married to the actress Lydia Fox. Apparently she's a member of the famous Fox acting dynasty. Number 3, though he won a BAFTA TV award for playing socially challenged Moss in The IT Crowd, he doesn't rate his performance in the cult sitcom, calling it a mere turn, which I don't really know what that means. He said, others are really good actors, so the show can contain something which is more of a turn than an acting performance. I wouldn't dignify what I do by calling it acting, which is his very ridiculous self-deprecating humor. It's like, well, you just wanted an award for your acting. I think you're probably pretty decent. He studied law at Cambridge University and was president of the famous Footlights Theatrical Club at the same time as John Oliver, who was one of Ayoade's writing partners during their college years.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. He's directed music videos for indie bands including Arctic Monkeys, Radiohead, Yeah Yeah Yeahs, Vampire Weekend, and Kasabian. He had a small cameo in The Mandalorian.
Mm-hmm.
He was linked briefly to the British baking show when it switched networks in the UK in 2016. According to The Sun, he was a leading candidate to replace the hosts at one point. And I really wish that would have happened. Especially watching all those YouTube clips you sent me of him and Neil. What's Neil's last name?
Noel Fielding?
Noel, that's his name. Noel Fielding. All these clips of the two of them together. And I was like, oh, that's so wonderful. And then I read this and I was like, oh, they would have been great together.
Yeah. Oh my god. Yeah, their banter is incredible.
Yep, that's, the 10 things you have to know. And if you're like, Victoria, that wasn't 10. Yeah, I skimmed over some of them because I thought they were not as fun to read. It was just about like, he doesn't particularly like interviews, according to this interview, where he ridicules the interviewer. And I'm like, okay, it's not something we have to know about him. So, okay, we've talked long and long about this book already, but do you want to give us kind of a premise of what this book is doing? Question mark?
Okay. So I will attempt to explain what this book is, in case you haven't figured it out from context. So this book is a satirical academic treatment of a horrible film called View from the Top, starring Gwyneth Paltrow. It's a rom-com about a girl from, quote, the wrong side of the tracks. as if Gwyneth Paltrow could be from the wrong side of the tracks, whose greatest ambition is to be a flight attendant for a major airline that does international flights. That's her, like, life's dream. There's some drama that makes no sense and a love story that makes no sense, and yeah. So, Richard Ayoade watches this film and thinks, I will write a book in which I walk through this film beat by beat and, like, analyze it down to, like, song choices and whatever. Yeah, I don't know what came over him, but I'm glad it did. So we get to know the film, and then the whole time he's, like, making fun of it by taking it super, super, super duper seriously. Like, he never breaks character. He treats it like it deserves to be discussed through the lenses of, he takes all these, like, film analysis, philosophy, feminism, historical context, like, analyzing the director's intention, even, like, some song analysis. Like, there's a whole section, there's, like, a cover of Time After Time that appears multiple times, so he does, like, an analysis of that song. It sounds super bizarre, and it's super funny, and niche, and weird, and yeah. So that's the book.
This podcast is made possible by our wonderful book club members. You can support the show by becoming a member on buymeacoffee.com/bookclubwithjv. So Julie and I are readers. We like to talk about books, but we're also writers. And so with our book club members, we love to share newsletters of things happening in our personal lives, as well as essays, poetry, other things we're writing. So, starting at $3 per month, book club members can connect with fellow listeners, help us select books for future episodes, unlock exclusive newsletters, poems, etc. that we write, and get early and discounted access to future events. If you want to take your support to the next level, you can also join the TISM tier, which starts at $5 per month. The TISM tier is all about autism. Are you an autistic person looking for community, a possible neurodiverse person looking for resources, or an ally hoping to learn from an actually autistic person? Members of this tier get access free to Julia's autism-related articles on Medium. The best part of any book club, besides the books, is the community. So join us in our growing community of book nerds by becoming a member of the book club today. You can follow the link in our show notes or go to buymeacoffee.com/bookclubwithjv to join the party. Now back to the books.
For the rest of this episode, we're going to talk through kind of an investigative lens.
Yeah.
Dissecting this book. Like, what is the author doing? Who is the book for? Why is it funny? Because there's nothing more enjoyable than someone sitting around and trying to decide how things are funny. I'm sure comedians everywhere love us. But that's what we're going to do, because this is what we do in this podcast. We talk about things in depth. In a way that Ayoade does, though I think we can take ourselves much more seriously than he does.
Yeah.
And we tend to pick books we think highly of.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, I guess that's the place to start, right? Is, like, he's taking a book that does not deserve this, or he's taking a film that does not deserve this level of attention and writing a whole book about it, right? Whereas, like, we take an hour-long episode to talk about sort of the highlighting points of a book that we think deserves our attention, right? But we don't give it, like, there is, like, a page per second of this film, you know what I mean? Like,
right, yeah.
Or per minute, like, it's a really in-depth breakdown. And it shouldn't work. Like, it shouldn't, like, you explain it to someone and they're like, that sounds really boring. Like, it shouldn't work. It's an absurd premise that he even, like, there's a section in the book where he, like, acknowledges that, like, when he first pitched the idea for the book to his publishers, and they were like, what? What are you talking about? It shouldn't work. So I want to know why it does.
Yeah. I think, in a way, it's what Ayoade does best, right? Like, it's comedy, it's writing, it's film, and he does it in his way. Like, I felt like I was watching a stand-up special as I was reading it. Like, I laughed as hard at this as I would if I was, like, watching someone do stand-up. Like, to the point that I had to, like, put the book down sometimes because I was laughing so hard. It's very him. Like, he knows his comedy voice, and he was able to put it in a book, which I think is an incredible feat, because so many comics are are good writers. Like, a lot of comics also do TV writing and movie writing, and they write their own stand-up. But I haven't always loved every comics books because sometimes they take themselves too seriously, you know, because it's like the story of their life told in a humorous way, but it's also like very personal, and it's like almost like a memoir, so it's supposed to be more official and more intimate than maybe their like actual comedy is. Whereas I feel like Ayoade, like, while he interweaves some like personal stories of his life, like, it's not ever posing as a memoir. It's like him doing what he does best, which many of us find humorous and are willing to buy the book, so it works out well for him.
Yeah, I also think his comedic voice translates particularly well to text because he has a very monotone delivery. His sort of character, his persona, his comedic persona is like an exaggerated version of himself, which is very awkward, intelligent, nerdy kind of like geek, you know, who like knows a lot and is gonna like lecture at you with all this information. And so that lends itself very nicely to, I am going to write a pretend book length essay, like analytical essay, in which I explain things to people. And it's, you know, you don't have to incorporate the kind of tone and physical comedy that like other comics might use, you know, when performing live, because he doesn't really use any of that. So, yeah.
And I think in the same way, when I was saying, like, I would get laughing so hard while reading, felt similar to stand-up also, because it wasn't just, like, a funny line. Like, there's some lines we'll get into when we get into, like, why is it funny, that we can pull out as particularly humorous, but it all, like, builds on itself.
Right.
So it's, like, I couldn't even, like, stop and, like, read something out loud to Vern and be like, oh my gosh, read this. Because that's not what's making me laugh. It's, like, the whole buildup of the entire chapter to get to that line. Or, you know, I'd have to, like, read him pages so you can, like, get, like, the full emphasis of the, like, a certain punchline. So I guess that's what also felt like stand-up comedy to me, too. Because, like, a lot of the comics I enjoy, like, I couldn't just, like, quote one thing they said. Because people are like, oh, okay, like, that's funny. But I'm like, no, you didn't get it. Like, they told this whole story, and then they got here, and then it was, like, a callback, and it was interesting.
And he never breaks character.
There's not, like, a foreword that's, like, super earnest, and it's like,
no,
thank you to my mother for always supporting me in my comic career, or something like that.
Yeah.
It's just, like, from the very beginning to the very end, even through the index, it's all the same voice, all the same joke. Yeah,
I could see how that kind of, it comes across as almost a performance then. I didn't really think about it that way, but that makes a lot of sense to me. Like, I could see myself watching this.
I want to listen to the audiobook of him reading this. Does that exist? Because I need it.
Ooh, yeah, I don't know. That would be great. Because I could see him turning it into a show where he, like, plays the clips and then explains, does the whole thing where he, like...
It's like a TEDx talk.
Yes! Like a fake TED talk. Oh, that would be so funny. Yeah, I think it would work really well. Okay, then, like, who's his target audience? Like, who is this book for? I mean, I guess I can start. I literally, when we wrote, who is this book for? The first thing I wrote was just, me?
He sat down, he's like, somewhere out there in this world is a woman named Julia Clausen who needs this book.
Yeah. That was his inspiration for writing it. He was like, Julia's gonna want to read this, so I gotta write it, I guess. Because we can get into it more in a bit, but his humor feels like very specifically autistic to me in a way that I've been kind of marinating on for a long time, of like, why does this feel so specific to me? And it's partly the style of humor, and then also it's like the perfect intersection of all of my special interests also, you know? So it's like, it's not just like the style of humor, but it's also like film and kind of literary criticism, and he's a writer and he brings in, you know, all these different lenses, and it's just like a magical combination. So anyway, I am then very curious to be like, what is the experience of, what is this like for other people? Who else finds this funny? I mean, clearly Victoria. And I was kind of worried no one else would find it funny. So like, who do you think this book is for?
Honestly, I think it's just Richard Ayoade being himself. I mean, it's still like a character in a way, but like kind of that like true to yourself and like writing for what he would want to read is like the vibe I get, because it doesn't feel like he's like reaching for a certain audience. And again, I'm not as familiar with his career. Like perhaps he's very attuned and he knows like there's a lot of intelligent, nerdy people who like my work. Let me write something that's intelligent and nerdy. Like perhaps maybe he's got that focus. Part of me also feels like, especially because he writes a whole scene of how he pitched this book and they were like, no, what? Just like he had this idea and he's like, I have to do this for me. And also on some platform, he knows he's a famous English comic. Like maybe the book isn't going to be a bestseller, but he's got an audience. Like he can write another one of these. And this isn't his first book. Like he's done other comic books where he does one about himself critiquing his own work. Like he's like writing about his work as if it's like super famous and he's at the very end of a very like prolific career, and he wrote it when he was like in his 30s and like just starting. So I think he's kind of like writing for what he wants to read with somewhat of a knowledge that he does have an audience that will go out and buy it. One of my favorite bits of all the YouTube clips you sent me of him is someone asked him like, do you need to watch the movie before you read his book? And he said, I encourage everyone to go out and buy the book and then decide if they want to read it. Which was hilarious. Like just like the like again, it's like, how do you explain that humor? It's like he twisted their like expectation. Like your expectation was like read the book and decide if you want to watch the movie, but he'd like buy the book and decide if you want to read it, because he's like, once you bought it, you can just decide. He doesn't take himself too seriously, and he displays that by being super serious, which is like the weirdest little twist that like we can see through his ultra seriousness as not being serious. I think the book's for himself, honestly.
That makes a lot of sense because I relate to him a lot. And so if he wrote it for himself, then I would be like by proxy a target audience member. So,
which also feels like a lot of the feedback that you get as a creative person. It's like, create the art that you want to consume. You know, like if you look out in the world and you can't find the work that like really speaks to you, or like you have something in you that you want to share. And for him, it's this like super intense academic critique of a ridiculous film. But instead of like bemoaning like, oh, that's not what people do, that's not what people write books about, I can't do that, he just goes and writes it, and it's wonderful, and the world is better for it.
And he's also like, he clearly knows his stuff, you know what I mean? Like it's an imitation, like a film critic, but it's a very, very, very good imitation. Yeah. Because he knows his stuff. He makes all these references, like very specific, like literary, film, philosophy, theology references. Like he throws in Heidegger and like very important writers and filmmakers, and like there's Bible quotes in there, and the style of writing is such a good imitation of like stuck-up academia. So you know that he like consumes this kind of stuff. You know what I mean? It's not like he's very much a part of this world and also maybe thinks it's a bit ridiculous. But part of me, as I was reading it, I was like, man, some of these references, like I don't know if it would make it really inaccessible to people, or, you know, if you're not like kind of in that niche little world. But I don't know. I guess if you know at least like one or two, if you have one or two of the circles in the Venn diagram, you could probably enjoy it, you know, and pick up on the rest. He's not mocking that style from the outside. He's mocking it from the inside, which makes it kind of sweet almost in this really bizarre way. Part of me wonders if it's one of those, you know, we've talked about like those films for filmmakers and there's books for authors, and I kind of wonder if this is kind of one of those things, maybe.
Well, I mean, even the fact that it's even if it's making fun of it, but it's in the realm of criticism. I always feel like the geekiest of geeks when I'm browsing the literary criticism section of a bookstore, because it's like, it's not enough for me to read the books. I need to read about how we read books. I need to read about the writing of books. It's like it's just like feeding your own ego in a way. I mean, but it's also so enjoyable. So I do think his audience is supposed to be niche. Like he's not writing to everyone. He's not even writing to everyone who likes him as a comic, because why you like him as a comic may not be actually your interest and background. And I think, like, I also feel like you, Julia, even though I enjoyed this book, I feel like I can recommend it to listeners of our podcast because I feel like we do have a lot of people who are very interested in how we read and how we understand the world and philosophy and how it intertwines with literature. But, like, that's not the whole world. That's not even all my friends. Okay, so we've talked so much about his humor, and I know Julia has done a lot of work to identify the types of humor. Why is this book funny?
Oh my god. Okay. So, the biggest type of humor that he uses is sarcasm through extreme hyperbole, which is kind of what we've been talking about this whole time.
So, in this bit, he's kind of going frame by frame through the opening and how the camera work is helping tell the story. So, up there, sky, lie dreams. Down here, land, lies reality. Donna is sitting on her bottom, behind, in front of a trailer. Behind her, lying on his behind, on a soiled couch. Seemingly asleep is her mom's fourth husband, Pete. This is the bedrock of great directing, translating ideas into images. And it's just, like, so ridiculous. And when I actually read this before I watched the film. I watched the film probably a third of the way through reading. And I thought it was going to be, like, slower. Because he goes so slow through this. I was like, whoa, was this scene, like, so dramatically, like, up and down and back? But no, it's just literally just the pan of a camera. And he's, like, he goes in minutely and makes this giant analysis and then says something so ridiculous. I don't know, for all of us, it's like, well, of course, like, making a film is turning ideas into images.
That's literally the definition of filmmaking.
The bedrock of great directing. And yeah, so that's his extreme hyperbole.
I feel like that one gives you a good sense of how he talks about the direction of the film. Because he takes something that's, like, so basic to filmmaking, like a student could make it, and then he's like, this is the most important thing. Another thing he does is he'll take a metaphor and then make it super literal. Like, you'll think he's going one direction, and then you realize, oh, he's interpreting this very, very literally. This is one of my favorite types of jokes that he does.
Okay, so I loved this one. So in the section Go Fly Yourself, he references The Ways of Seeing by John Berger, which I always feel so fancy because, like, we read it in college and, like, it comes up all the time. It's this, like, modernist text about how we see the world and, like, how we are seen and being so seen and whatever. So he's, like, quoting Berger to, like, make a point. So he says, Berger goes on to write, this is in quotes, this determines not only most relations between men and women, but also the relation of women to themselves. The surveyor of woman in herself is male, the surveyed is female. Thus she turns herself into an object of vision, a sight. And then back in Ayoade's voice. But by this point, Berger was obviously losing focus. How can you survey something inside of you? It's dark in there and pretty gloopy. And I died. That was so funny. But yeah, especially the gloopy. It's just the perfect word. It's pretty dark in there. Pretty gloopy.
Pretty gloopy. Oh my god. It's like, well, we're gonna go through more, but I feel like the making metaphors literal, like that kind of deliberate misunderstanding is part of the humor that I find so autistic, because I feel like that's one of the things that, like, my friends and I, my autistic friends and I, like, do with each other that we find funny is, like, we sort of exaggerate the ways that we already misunderstand stuff, and we sort of turn it on other people in an exaggerated way, kind of deliberately misunderstand and reinterpret and take things really literally. And so, like, any of his jokes where he's and it's usually some really long academic thing, really intellectual. And then the punchline is like, yo, you didn't understand at all. But he's taking it so seriously. And so, yeah, that's one of my favorite types of bits that he does. Similarly, I think, he uses very, very fancy language for very mundane, very not fancy subjects. There's a few examples.
So one of the sections that made me cry laughing was when he is exploring different advertising campaigns of different airlines and like how ridiculous they are. And he's kind of examining like the sexualization of stewardesses or flight attendants and how different airlines kind of like sold that. And it's actually really interesting because it's like actually could be a very serious thing to discuss of like, why were there stewardesses on planes? And it was a traditional female role. And he talks about like the influence of like World War II and how there was a lot of women who were like pushed out of the workplace again when men came back from war, and how this was like one opportunity that was there for them. And originally they were like trained nurses, but they didn't want people to feel unsafe when they were trying to sell these commercial flights. So they had to make it less like, oh, these people are here for your safety, because no, you're very, very safe. But these people are here to look nice and help you and make you feel fancy and accommodated and like whatever. So anyways, it's actually a very interesting section, but of course he like infuses it with so much humor. And he goes one by one. Here's Air Jamaica. Air Jamaica went with, "We make you feel good all over," which, even if you were just to focus on your inner ear, is a flat out fib. Few things are guaranteed to make people feel worse than air travel. You are 100 times more likely to catch a cold on a plane. You're exposed to more radiation than you would be if you stood next to a nuclear reactor. And perhaps most pressingly, it makes a man mighty windy. The moment right before flatus passes through the rectum is one of tension and intense self-hatred. Sure, once it's out, you feel like God. But until your alimentary canal deflates, you want to die and you don't care how. Such a great example of his fancy language for a very unfancy subject.
Literally farting on a plane.
Yeah, like he never even uses those words. He uses every word but, and it's so good.
Oh my god, me editing this episode, like this is literally just gonna be me laughing at this point. Yeah, that's an amazing one.
I'm trying to feel, okay, the Air France section is so funny. I'm trying to see what category it falls under for you. Okay, so this is like such another example of like making metaphors literal or like taking things very literally. This is one that I wrote down. LOL Air France, page 80. That's all I wrote in my notes. Air France had the slogan, "Have you ever done it the French way?" But how can you fly in a way that's particularly French? Does the plane wear a beret and leave a trail of, I can't pronounce this French word, gallows fumes? Are the in-flight announcements underscored by an accordion? Are other planes, especially if they're on their gap years, inexplicably attracted to them? What is so specifically French about these aircraft? Are they just giant winged baguettes? Or is the advertiser trying to suggest that the French cabin crew may well, what exactly? Why don't they just call it Caligulaire? Our seats are wiped clean for a reason. Yes. The giant winged baguettes, there's nothing better.
Are university students, especially if they're on their gap year, inexplicably attracted to them? Oh my god. And then I just imagine the in-flight announcements with an accordion underneath. That would be amazing. So like, he takes something like that, like doing it the French way, right? So there's like a ton of subtext there, and we know, because he set up all this stuff about how airlines sexualized flight attendants, right? We know what that is referring to. But instead, he's like, that doesn't make any sense, right? He's pointing out the ridiculousness of it by like deliberately misunderstanding the point, as if to say like, why would you use this like sexual subtext? And then he like is very long-winded with these jokes too. Like he, it's not just like a quick punchline. He like goes into great detail about it, which also feels very autistic to me. Is like he's like really trying to understand what would make an airline French. There's like an earnestness to it, even as he's like making fun of them and calling them out.
Okay, so digs at the greats, like he's comparable to them. These come up quite often in there, particularly if you're familiar with like playwrights and film like screenwriters. So I didn't always get all of these, but they're the one that I picked out from your list, I did also enjoy. So Barreto is the name of the director. Barreto shows us a dry, barren terrain, and it's middle absurdly like something Beckett might have written if he had ever had the balls to come up with a plot. It's like the greatest playwright of his time, or
Yeah.
one of them, if he had the balls to come up with a plot, he would have thought of something as beautiful as this, which just like underscores how ridiculous and like on the nose so much of the directing of this film is.
Yeah, to make a comparison to Beckett, who's like, especially Waiting for Godot, right? The whole thing is a metaphor, you know, about like nihilism and stuff. And then like this film that he's talking about is so incredibly literal that like drawing a comparison and calling Beckett terrible and this director great kind of points out just how different they are.
So he also has these critiques of class and sex and gender by mimicking these arguments about class and sex, but drawing it out so you can see the flaws in the argument, even though he's like taking that side in a way sometimes.
Yeah, he has a whole section about Gwyneth Paltrow's company Goop that is just incredible. It's like the best takedown of Goop I've ever heard. Like he talks about the vagina candles and the eggs and just kind of Gwyneth Paltrow's whole persona and being super expensive and it's like really scathing. And yeah, I love that chapter. Yeah, and then he also like loves drawing out discussions on things that don't really matter. Like part of when he's like maybe pointedly misunderstanding something, he also misses the purpose of something a lot. Like he'll whatever direction you think he's gonna go, he'll go the opposite direction down this like side tangent that does not matter at all, and he'll spend a whole page on it, you know, because he's just like, we must analyze everything. And I feel like that's a pretty good critique of criticism as well, because, you know, sometimes we can get bogged down in these tiny details that like maybe don't matter. But we treat with all this importance, you know? I guess kind of where I was explaining how some of this humor feels particularly autistic to me, and it's like if we wanted to summarize like why is it funny, it's this sort of like blatantly missing what's actually going on to an exaggerated degree, maybe to point out the flaws in what's actually going on. And it just feels like a super autistic sense of humor, and like we sort of take the things that autistic people already do, where we miss subtext or tone or social cues or context or whatever, either turn it on its head, turn it back on the people who would maybe make fun of us, or like exaggerate it to a degree where it's like more clear and obvious what we're doing. But there's also this second layer of like where a lot of times you need to be super familiar with a shared special interest, right? So you need to be able to get all the niche references. I can't tell you how many jokes, like I'm hilarious in my head, but there are so many jokes that like only make sense if you get this very, very specific line from like 3 different films. It's like, I don't think any of my friends would get that exact overlap of my knowledge to find it funny. And so like there's so many jokes that I just don't say. So yeah, I think a lot of our humor is like dumb references and repetition of references to things. So you have to have that like particular knowledge of something along with our sense of humor in order to like tap into that, which, you know, it is fairly similar to something neurotypical people also do, but it just felt so specific that, like, as I was kind of breaking down why I found this book funny, it was kind of a fun exercise in actually being like, what do I find funny? You know, and like, what is autistic humor like? And so it was kind of fun.
Yeah, I feel like his humor is like perfectly wonderful in a way that he's using what you're reading as like an autistic lens, or we're reading as an autistic lens, to point out the like absolute absurdity of things like language and film and culture.
Mm-hmm.
And there's so many things in our like neurotypical dominant culture that we're just like, yes, this is how it is.
Mm-hmm.
And then it takes a neurodivergent person to come in and be like, why the hell is it that way? And you're like, that makes no sense.
Yeah.
And I'm like, yeah, you're right. And I think it's like exactly what we need. And we've talked before in the podcast how this is especially important in like super serious contexts like climate change, and like where neurodivergent people are stepping up and saying like, hey, you all are saying one thing and not doing it. So like, can we just please pay attention and do the things we said we're going to do? And that's why I think every judicial court in the country should have a neurodiverse person there to like help make decisions. Because like
we need a Supreme Court of autistic people. That's what we need.
Because they would know their stuff and not
Yeah.
be all like double-minded about a lot of it. Not to say all autistic people want to be on a Supreme Court, but I think there's a lot who could be great at it. So I think it makes for a wonderful sense of humor, and a lot of it made me think of what we discussed in Kate Fox's book, Watching the English, of like how self-ridicule and self-deprecating humor is particularly English, and like we already acknowledge like, oh, we find their humor really funny, and it kind of makes sense that we would see such a similar vibe from Ayoade, because he's not, like you said, he's not on the outside making fun of film.
Mm-hmm.
And being like, they're so stuck up and ridiculous. But he's like in it, being stuck up and ridiculous about it. And that's what's funny. And like pointing out like, oh, aren't we ridiculous that we sit around and say all this stuff about films that somehow like meet the mark of like a great film? Why don't we do it with a ridiculous film? So I really enjoyed it.
It's a great time.
When it comes to Ayoade's writing, I honestly don't know anyone else who writes like him, so I would recommend his other books if you want something very similar. I haven't read them, but they seem also really humorous. As far as writers who like get into like niche film topics, like they write what they love and what they're interested in, what they want to read about, which I think is what Ayoade's doing. It makes me think of Haley and Victoria, who are the writers over at Gold Plated Girls newsletter. And Haley did this whole series called Single Women in Hollywood. And she created like this matrix of like these 4 different quadrants. There's like horny and sexless as like one spectrum, and then messy and organized as the other spectrum. So then you have this intersection of those. And she like goes, it's like a 5-part series because she goes and like looks at single women in TV and movies that are like horny and messy and organized and sexless, and like what those tropes look like. And it is absolutely wonderful and takes very seriously characters from rom-coms and other TV and film that's just kind of pushed aside as like not, worthy of critical analysis. So go read their stuff. It's hilarious.
So, okay. If you like this book, I recommend going on YouTube and finding old versions of the Big Fat Quiz of the Year. It's a BBC thing that literally happens once a year. And it's at New Year's, and it's a review of like the pop culture references of the previous year. So they have a section about songs, like political things, film and TV, and it's really stupid. But they bring on a bunch of comics to do it, and for many, many years, Richard Ayoade and Noel Fielding were a team, and they never won a single time. They did like 4 or 5 years in a row as a team, and they never won. But they're so funny together. If you can find old versions of that with those two together, highly recommend. And then obviously watch The IT Crowd, where he plays Moss. Very, very good. And then 2 other things that this book made me think of while we were talking about it. I really love the podcast, How Did This Get Made? I've referenced it before, but it's where like 3 comedians take apart really bad movies. So they watch them together and then they talk about how bad they are. And it's a very different tone. It's a much more American tone. Like they don't take them seriously at all, but it's still really fun. And then also a book that Victoria got for me, actually, called Shit Actually by Lindy West, who also wrote Shrill. She writes comical short essays about great films, or not so great films, just like some films. It's the most random collection of movies you've ever seen, but it's kind of like watching, like she's live tweeting, watching the movie, with really a lot of melodrama in her jokes and a lot of capitalization jokes and stuff, and it's really funny. So yeah, those are some good like taking the piss out of film stuff that you might enjoy. Dun, dun, dun.
So the part of the show you all love. I don't know. I hope you like it. We enjoy it. What we're currently obsessed with, things that are bringing us joy. You can go first.
Oh my god, you're watching Big Mouth?
Yeah. Julie gets a sneak peek because she sees my notes on a shared document.
Oh my god, I'm so excited.
Okay, I guess I'll go first then. So Varun and I went to Mars Brewing Company here in Chicago. And they have, it was like a Tuesday night. I don't know, something chill. There was not very many people, and they had like a screen pulled down and it was playing some videos or whatever in the background, but someone put on Big Mouth. And so we didn't have any sound. We were just reading subtitles. And our date went from us having great in-depth conversations to us just watching Big Mouth together. Because we were like, oh my gosh. And they happened to start it with like season 1, episode 1. So we were like, this was funny. And so we went home and we started watching it. And then we watched it again last night. And yeah, so we're like 5 or 6 episodes in now. And it's great. I remember Julia would watch it and I would always walk in at the most awkward times. I mean, it's such like, it's all about like puberty and awkwardness, right? And she's like, it's a good show, I swear. And I'm like, I don't know what I just saw. I don't even know. But that's been really enjoyable. I also have been enjoying the podcast, The Illusionist, which is so great. Julia, it's a podcast about etymology.
What?
Yeah, Illusionist, so ALLUSIONIST. The host, I'm blanking on her name. She's a British woman. Lovely. She was like a guest on another podcast. And I was like, oh, that sounds interesting. I want to listen. And so they're very short, like bite-sized episodes of like her just talking about language and English and like where our words come from. And so some of them are a lot of like in-depth background. Like I listened to one on like where SOS comes from. And it actually doesn't even mean save our ship because it was like an international designation. So it's not in English. It's just because the Morse code is the most recognizable. And you're not going to get confused for something else. And so then there was like all this history and she talked to like these like naval safety people and historians. And it was just really fascinating deep dive. And then others are just like really kind of silly. Like she did a food quiz with Samin Nosrat and Rishikesh Hirray, which of course I listened to that episode, where it's just a bunch of like random questions about food related terms and their etymology, and Samin got like all the questions wrong, which was really funny. But yeah, so it's great. It's and for people listening to this podcast who might also be language obsessed like us, you might enjoy it. And lastly, I have a lot this week. For me, I usually have like 1 or 2. I came with a list. The Parasocial Club, which is my lovely brother's band. He's also the creator of the music for our podcast. They dropped a new EP today called Isolation. It's a few songs they wrote during the pandemic. So, yeah.
Sweet. I'm so excited you're watching Big Mouth.
Yeah.
I'm so excited. Oh my God.
I know. I'm like, why didn't we watch it together? I should have just sat down, buckled in.
It's because you always walked in on the worst times, and like, I'm very bad at pitching stuff. Like, I can't describe things in a way that makes people want to watch them. Like, how did I ever work in marketing? I don't know. Like, don't ask me to pitch anything. I will either explain it in excruciating detail, or I will describe a completely irrelevant like thing about it. Like I can't. I don't know what people enjoy. What do people find funny? I don't know. So I'm still playing catch up a little bit with my recommendations from our hiatus. So I have a very long list and I'm going to go quickly. Dear White People, season 4. Haven't watched it yet, but that's happening this week. Casa de Papel, Money Heist, season 5. Oh my God, so much drama. Huge cliffhanger. There's one more season and I'm like dying. Lil Nas X's new album, Montero, blew me away. He's got some great features on there, but he's also got some like more chill songs that actually are my favorites, I think. Because he normally writes like bops, you know? But like actually, yeah, he's got some really good like kind of sad songs that I'm like, oh my God, okay, all right. Casey Musgrave's new album, Star-Crossed. It's a breakup album. Very lovely. Yeah, I wasn't like a huge fan of the one that won a Grammy, but I really like this one. So I don't know what that says about me. And then Churches, the Scottish band, they have a new album called Screen Violence that is very angry. So if you want some angry girl stuff, this one's good. So, whew, that's my list.
Thanks, Julia, for sharing this comedy gold, this book with us.
You're welcome. Thanks for reading it.
Opening your heart to potential disappointment, but hopefully this has been good experience to be able to talk about it.
Yeah. Oh my God. This is the dream.
So, lesson for the day: don't be afraid to share your love with others.
You got to learn to be okay if they say no, which is still something that I'm working on. Share your exuberance, and then I find if I'm very vocal about how much I love something, it takes about a year, but eventually someone will be like, "Hey, you know that thing that you always talk about? You're right."
Which is honestly like how I watch nearly anything. Is like if Rune and I decide to start a show or something, we'll like flip through and I'm like, you know what, Julia said good things about this one like 15 months ago, but I think maybe we could watch it.
Thank you for listening to Book Club with Julia and Victoria. We would love to hear your thoughts on this book or the topic we discussed, so you can share your review and recommendations with us on Instagram at Book Club with JV, on our website, bookclubwithjv.com, or by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts. You can also visit our website for show notes with links to all of the recommendations and the things bringing us joy. If you don't already, go ahead and follow us on whichever podcast platform you are listening on so that you can be notified when our next episode is released. This episode was co-hosted and produced by myself, Victoria Bruick, along with Julia Clausen. Rebecca Gasme provides us with project management support. Our music is composed by Greg Bruick, and our logo was designed by Gabby Fabland. Until next time, happy reading.